Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. Tonight we're diving into one of the oldest and strangest habits humans have ever cooked up: clothing. So before you get too comfortable, take a second, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always cool to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe flick on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For most of early human history, our ancestors probably wore absolutely nothing at all. No shirts, no shoes, no pants, no tiny decorative scarves whose only job is to make winter somehow more miserable. Just groups of anxious humans wandering through dangerous landscapes, totally exposed to weather, bugs, sharp rocks, and every bad idea nature could come up with. At first, this wasn't really a problem. Early humans evolved in warm African climates where clothing was mostly unnecessary. In fact, humans had already lost much of their body hair millions of years earlier. Scientists think this happened partly because sweating became critical for endurance hunting. While most animals overheated after short chases, humans could keep jogging slowly for hours under the sun until their prey finally collapsed from exhaustion. So humanity's big evolutionary edge became persistent sweating, a truly majestic start for our species. But losing fur created obvious problems almost immediately. Cold nights turned miserable. Rain turned miserable. Thorny bushes turned miserable. Sitting on cold rocks turned miserable. Honestly, early humanity spent a shocking amount of time just discovering new forms of discomfort. Without thick fur, human skin was vulnerable to cuts, bug bites, sunburn, frost, and rough ground. Other animals showed up to nature fully equipped. Bears got fur coats, turtles got armor. Humans got anxiety and slightly better stamina. At first, people obviously used temporary coverings rather than real clothing. Animal hides draped over shoulders during cold weather. Leaves wrapped around sensitive areas while crossing rough terrain. Primitive sandals may have protected feet from sharp stones. Nothing matched. Nobody cared about looks yet. There was no prehistoric fashion critic standing by the river saying, "Honestly, that mammoth skin really washes you out." The oldest clothing existed purely because survival kept getting in the way of comfort. Archaeologists think humans started wearing regular clothing somewhere between 100,000 and 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. And weirdly enough, one of the biggest clues comes from lice. Human body lice evolved separately from head lice, and body lice live specifically inside clothing. By studying these parasites genetically, scientists estimated when humans began consistently wearing garments. So one of the greatest discoveries about civilization came from examining prehistoric bugs hiding in ancient loincloths. Human history is occasionally less glamorous than documentaries suggest. Early clothing itself was deeply unpleasant by modern standards. Animal hides were heavy, stiff, itchy, and smelled extraordinary in the worst possible way. Wet fur trapped odor beautifully. Imagine wearing damp deer skin beside a smoky fire for 3 straight weeks with no soap, no toothpaste, and no concept of personal space. Romantic depictions of prehistoric life tend to skip over the constant stench of wet animal and human exhaustion. Still, clothing changed everything. Humans could survive colder climates, migrate across dangerous regions, and endure brutal winters that would otherwise kill them quickly. A stitched fur garment may not sound revolutionary now, but back then it was basically prehistoric technology at its peak. And unfortunately, once humans realized clothing could protect the body, it didn't take long before they realized clothing could also impress other humans. That was the moment this whole situation became permanently ridiculous. For thousands of years, early humans survived reasonably well in warmer climates with minimal clothing. Then, the Ice Age arrived and ruined absolutely everything. Suddenly, Large parts of Europe and Asia turned into brutally cold landscapes filled with snow, freezing winds, and animals large enough to flatten a human by accident while just existing nearby. Temperatures dropped to deadly levels. Nights became unbearable. Entire regions became frozen environments where a naked human could survive about 3 minutes before becoming a cautionary tale for the rest of the tribe. Humanity had a serious problem. Unlike mammoths, humans had no thick fur. Unlike wolves, humans had no insulating coats. Unlike bears, humans couldn't just hibernate through winter looking majestic. Humans entered the Ice Age equipped with determination, basic tools, and a level of confidence wildly unsupported by biology. Clothing stopped being optional very quickly. Animal hides became essential for survival. Hunters used the skins of reindeer, bison, wolves, and mammoths to create primitive coverings. Ironically, the same animals trying to kill humans often became humanity's best protection against freezing weather afterward. Nature really loves recycling, but making useful clothing was incredibly difficult. Fresh hides rotted fast. Wet fur became heavy and foul-smelling. Frozen skins turned stiff as wood. Early humans had to scrape fat from hides using stone tools, dry them carefully, soften them repeatedly, and eventually stitch pieces together using bone needles and animal sinew. This process probably took enormous effort. One proper winter outfit may have required multiple animal hides and days of labor, and unlike modern clothing stores, there was no exchange policy if the stitching failed halfway through a snowstorm. Archaeologists have discovered ancient bone needles dating back tens of thousands of years, proving early humans developed sew, surprisingly advanced sewing techniques. These were no longer random fur blankets. Humans were now creating fitted garments, boots, gloves, hoods, and layered clothing designed specifically for survival. And honestly, layered clothing probably saved humanity as a species. Without proper garments, humans could never have migrated deep into colder regions. Entire populations would have frozen during winter migrations. Clothing allowed humans to spread across continents, hunt in extreme climates, and eventually dominate environments that should have killed them outright. But something else happened too. Once humans began wearing clothing regularly, people naturally started noticing whose clothing looked better. One hunter had cleaner fur, another had softer hides. Someone decorated boots with beads or teeth. Suddenly, survival gear slowly turned into social competition. Humanity had officially discovered fashion, and from that moment onward, history became an endless cycle of humans making clothing increasingly impractical in order to impress other humans who were secretly also uncomfortable. At some point, early humans crossed a very important line in history. Clothing stopped being only about survival and quietly became something else entirely: social competition. Because once everyone in the tribe was no longer freezing to death equally, people naturally started noticing details. One hunter had thicker fur, another wore cleaner hides. Someone stitched beads into a cloak. Someone else decorated boots with animal teeth. And somewhere in prehistory, one exhausted human probably looked at another exhausted human and thought, honestly, his mammoth cape is a bit excessive. That was the beginning of fashion. The strange thing about humans is that we almost immediately turn useful objects into social signals. Food becomes luxury cuisine. Houses become status symbols. Weapons become ceremonial decorations. And clothing quickly became one of the easiest ways to display skill, wealth, power, and attractiveness without saying a word. A well-made outfit suggested many things. It meant you or your family had access to successful hunters. It showed sewing ability, resource access, and survival knowledge. Decorative items suggested spare time and stability. In harsh, prehistoric conditions, having enough extra energy to decorate clothing was itself a flex. "Look at me," said the man wearing wolf teeth around his neck. "I survived winter and still had time for accessories." Different groups also began developing distinct styles. Certain tribes preferred specific animal furs, patterns, ornaments, or dyes. Clothing slowly became tied to identity. People could recognize allies, rivals, or outsiders just by appearance. Humans had invented visual tribal branding thousands of years before modern companies started putting tiny crocodiles on polo shirts. Decoration expanded rapidly. Shells, feathers, bones, beads, ivory, and carved ornaments appeared across ancient garments. Some items likely carried spiritual meaning. Others probably existed simply because humans enjoy showing off. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient beads over 100,000 years old, proving humanity became emotionally attached to decoration almost immediately after discovering survival, which honestly explains a lot about modern civilization. The most impressive part is that all this happened while daily life remained unbelievably brutal. People still faced starvation, disease, predators, freezing temperatures, and violent injuries constantly. Yet even surrounded by danger, humans still found time to think, yes, but this cloak could use more decorative shells, and perhaps that is one of the most human traits imaginable. Even in prehistoric times, people wanted to feel respected, admired, attractive, or important. Clothing became part survival tool, part emotional armor. It helped humans express identity long before writing existed. Unfortunately, this also created a new problem IT still suffers from today. Judging strangers entirely based on what they are wearing, a tradition we have somehow maintained with remarkable consistency for tens of thousands of years. For early humans, one of the greatest technological breakthroughs in history was not the wheel, metalworking, or agriculture. It was poking holes into dead animal skin with sharp objects. Not glamorous, certainly, but incredibly important. At first, prehistoric clothing was probably little more than hides draped loosely across the body. Effective enough for basic warmth, but terrible during storms, hunting trips, or long migrations. Loose skins slipped constantly, trapped moisture poorly, and made movement awkward. Trying to run through snow while holding together a falling fur blanket was not ideal for survival. Eventually, humans developed tools that changed everything. Bone needles. Archaeologists have discovered finely crafted needles dating back tens of thousands of years. Some so small and precise. Do they look surprisingly modern? These were not crude sharpened sticks either. Many had carefully carved eyes for threading sinew or plant fibers, which means somewhere in Ice Age history, a prehistoric human sat patiently inventing sewing while everyone else nearby was trying not to freeze to death. That person deserves more appreciation. Honestly, sewing allowed humans to create fitted clothing for the first time. Sleeves, leg coverings, boots, gloves, hoods, layered garments that trapped heat efficiently and stayed secure during movement. Suddenly, humans could survive environments that previously would have killed them almost immediately. This was especially important during migrations into northern Europe and Siberia. Temperatures in these regions were absolutely brutal. Without proper stitched clothing, entire groups would have frozen during winter. Fur alone was not enough. Clothing needed structure, layering, and insulation. And unlike modern winter jackets, prehistoric clothing had no zippers, synthetic fibers, or waterproof coatings. If your boots failed during a snowstorm, there was no customer support department. Nature simply removed you from the conversation permanently. Different animals also provided different materials. Reindeer hides insulated well. Fur-lined boots protected feet from frostbite. Sinew from animal tendons became durable thread. Early humans learned which materials worked best through generations of trial and error, which is a polite historical way of saying many people probably froze horribly while everyone else took notes. Clothing also began reflecting increasing specialization inside human groups. Some individuals likely became skilled specifically at preparing hides and sewing garments. In many prehistoric societies, clothing production probably required enormous labor and knowledge. A well-made outfit was valuable property, not something casually replaced every season because a magazine declared brown emotionally outdated. And Page. Perhaps that is what makes early clothing so fascinating. Every stitch represented survival. A fur cloak was not just decoration. It meant warmth, protection, mobility, and life itself. Humans survived the Ice Age not because they were the strongest animals on Earth, but because they learned how to adapt creatively also, because mammoths came with built-in winter coats, which humanity very opportunistically borrowed afterward. At some point in human history, clothing stopped being only practical and became something far more dangerous, attractive. Once basic survival was under control, humans began using clothing to impress each other. And honestly, this was inevitable. Humans cannot leave anything simple for very long. Give people a useful invention, and eventually someone will decorate it unnecessarily in hopes of finding romance. Early clothing likely started gaining symbolic meaning thousands of years ago. Certain furs became associated with strength or hunting skill. Decorative bead. Suggested status. Rare feathers, shells, and animal teeth displayed success, bravery, or wealth. Humans had discovered that appearance could influence social standing long before written language even existed. A person wearing beautifully crafted clothing immediately stood out, and attraction mattered enormously in prehistoric societies. Survival depended heavily on group cooperation, family bonds, and reproduction. Looking healthy, capable, and resourceful increased social value. Clothing became part of that signal. A well-dressed hunter appeared skilled. A carefully decorated woman might signal family connections, craftsmanship, or access to valuable resources. In simple terms, prehistoric humans accidentally invented peacocking. Other animals already did similar things. Birds display bright feathers. Deer grow antlers. Humans stitched wolf teeth onto cloaks and thought, this should help. And to be fair, it probably did. Archaeologists have discovered ancient beads and ornaments, dating back over 100,000 years. Some were crafted from shells transported enormous distances, suggesting people traded decorative items long before they traded anything particularly practical. Humanity saw shiny objects and collectively decided, yes, we'll walk 200 miles for this tiny, polished rock. Body decoration expanded alongside clothing. Early humans painted skin, tattooed bodies, braided hair, and wore jewelry made from bone, ivory, stone, and animal parts. Clothing became part of a much larger social language. It communicated age, status, group identity, experience, and attractiveness without speaking at all. And importantly, this changed human behavior permanently. Once appearance became socially meaningful, people began caring deeply about what others thought of them. Embarrassment, pride, envy, admiration. Clothing started triggering emotions far beyond simple warmth. Humans were no longer just surviving nature. They were surviving each other's opinions, which historically speaking becomes much more exhausting. Different groups also developed beauty standards. Some admired elaborate decorations. Others valued rare materials or specific colors. Across thousands of years and countless cultures, one thing remained remarkably consistent. Humans willingly made life more uncomfortable in order to look impressive. That pattern begins here, deep in prehistory beside fires and animal skin tents. And eventually it leads directly to powdered wigs, corsets, impossible shoes, and modern designer clothing that costs the same as a small medieval farm while containing about 4 teaspoons of actual fabric. For a very long time, humans probably viewed nakedness the same way animals still do now, completely normal. A deer does not wake up feeling embarrassed. Wolves are not hiding behind trees discussing body confidence issues. Most animals simply exist without worrying whether anyone is judging their thighs. Humans, however, eventually became psychologically complicated. Societies grew larger and more organized. Clothing slowly became tied to ideas of privacy, morality, sexuality, and social order. Modesty was not invented overnight. It developed gradually across thousands of years as humans formed permanent settlements, religions, family structures, and increasingly strict social expectations. In small prehistoric groups, survival mattered far more than embarrassment. But once larger communities emerged, human behavior became more regulated. Clothing started separating public life from private life. Certain body parts became sexualized. Rules appeared. Customs formed. Humanity began the endless historical tradition of deciding which random areas of the body were scandalous this century. And honestly, the results were wildly inconsistent. In some ancient cultures, exposed legs were shocking, while bare chests were perfectly normal. In others, hair became deeply sexualized. Some societies demanded heavy coverings, while others barely cared about nudity at all. Human modesty rules often make less sense the longer you study them. The ancient Egyptians, for example, wore relatively light clothing because of the hot climate. Greek athletes sometimes competed entirely nude. Meanwhile, later societies could become deeply offended by exposed ankles. Humanity somehow traveled from public Olympic nudity to that woman's elbow is causing moral collapse. Religion also played a massive role as spiritual systems developed. Clothing became linked to purity, discipline, and social identity. Priests wore special garments. Religious laws regulated fabrics, hairstyles, coverings, and jewelry. In many societies, controlling appearance became a way of controlling behavior itself. And once morality entered fashion, things became exhausting permanently. Clothing now carried emotional and social consequences. A person dressed incorrectly could appear disrespectful, immoral, poor, rebellious, or dangerous. Fashion stopped being only personal. It became police. Political, religious, and cultural all at once. This also explains why humans become strangely emotional about clothing. Even today, across history, arguments over clothing have sparked outrage, laws, punishments, protests, and endless public debates. Entire civilizations have genuinely panicked over skirts, trousers, wigs, sleeves, hats, and visible knees. Imagine explaining that to an early hunter from 40,000 years ago. Yes, we covered ourselves to survive winter, reasonable, and eventually people started fighting over whether shoulders were inappropriate. Perhaps the mammoths should have won. Still, modesty gave clothing deeper meaning. Garments became symbols of identity, belonging, respectability, and adulthood. Humans no longer wore clothing simply because nature was cold. They wore it because society was watching. And unfortunately for humanity, society never really stops watching once it starts. As human civilizations grew larger, clothing stopped being just personal expression and became something far more powerful, a way to separate people. Very quickly, societies realized clothing could instantly reveal wealth, status, profession, religion, and power without anyone speaking a single word. A king dressed differently from a farmer. Priests wore sacred garments. Soldiers wore uniforms. Merchants displayed expensive fabrics. Slaves and laborers often wore rough, simple clothing designed more for practicality than dignity. Humanity had invented visual hierarchy, and people became obsessed with it. In ancient Egypt, wealthy elites wore fine linen, while workers dressed far more simply beneath the brutal desert heat. In Rome, senators wore specific purple stripes, reserved only for their class. In medieval Europe, some governments even passed sumptuary laws controlling who could wear certain colors, furs, or jewelry. Imagine being arrested because your hat looked financially overconfident. Purple dye became especially famous because it was incredibly expensive to produce. In some ancient societies, purple clothing was restricted almost entirely to royalty and emperors. Thousands of sea snails had to be processed just to create small amounts of dye. Entire coastlines reportedly smelled horrific from production. Humanity looked at mountains of rotting shellfish and thought, yes, this will symbolize elegance. And somehow, it worked. Clothing also became deeply tied to labor. Farmers needed durable garments. Hunters required mobility. Nobles preferred decorative clothing, proving they did not perform physical work themselves. Long sleeves, delicate fabrics, pale skin, and elaborate accessories all quietly communicated the same message. I am wealthy enough not to carry heavy objects, which remains surprisingly consistent even today. The richer societies became, the more impractical elite fashion often grew. Massive robes, delicate embroidery, impossible hairstyles, and restrictive garments showed that wealthy people had servants, free time, and privacy. Protection from ordinary labor. Clothing evolved into visible proof that someone lived differently from everyone else. And naturally, lower classes copied elite styles whenever possible. This triggered a cycle repeated throughout history endlessly. The rich adopted new fashions to distinguish themselves, everyone else imitated them, the elites then changed styles again to remain socially separate. Humanity essentially turned fabric into an endless psychological arms race. Even military clothing reflected status. Decorative armor, cloaks, feathers, medals, and ceremonial uniforms transformed warfare into something halfway between survival and theater. Some commanders dressed so elaborately they practically glowed on battlefields, which seems strategically questionable, honestly. But perhaps the strangest part is how quickly humans accepted this system. People began making assumptions instantly based on appearance. Respect, trust, fear, attraction, and authority all became connected to clothing. And once civilization reached that stage, clothing stopped being just protection from nature. It became protection from social judgment, to which for many humans across history probably felt significantly more terrifying. As civilizations became more organized, clothing slowly transformed into something sacred. People no longer dressed only for warmth, beauty, or status. Now, clothing also carried spiritual meaning. Priests wore special robes. Religious leaders covered specific body parts. Certain fabrics became holy, while others became forbidden. Humanity had officially reached the stage where even pants could offend the gods under the wrong circumstances. And surprisingly, many ancient people took these rules extremely seriously. In ancient Egypt, priests often shaved their bodies completely and wore carefully cleaned linen garments during rituals. Purity mattered enormously. In Mesopotamia, temple workers wore symbolic robes connected to divine authority. Ancient Jewish law regulated fabrics, coverings, and ritual garments in extraordinary detail. Later, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and countless other traditions developed their own clothing customs tied to morality and spirituality. Suddenly, getting dressed each morning could become a religious statement. Clothing helped distinguish sacred spaces from ordinary life. Priests dressed differently because they represented something beyond everyday society. Their garments symbolized wisdom, authority, purity, sacrifice, or closeness to the divine. Of course, humans being humans, religion and status quickly became tangled together. Religious clothing often became expensive, elaborate, and politically powerful. Gold embroidery, silk robes, jeweled crowns, ceremonial fabrics imported from distant lands. Some temples possessed wardrobes wealthier than entire villages, which must have been slightly frustrating for starving peasants standing outside while priests discussed spiritual humility and gemstone-covered robes. But symbolism mattered deeply in ancient societies. Colors carried meaning. White represented purity in some cultures. Black symbolized mourning or authority. Purple suggested divine kingship. Even hairstyles and beard length could hold religious importance. And once societies attached morality to clothing, judgment followed immediately. Certain garments became associated with virtue, while others suggested corruption or rebellion. Covering the body became tied to discipline and self-control. Entire communities began monitoring appearance constantly. A person dressed incorrectly could appear sinful, disrespectful, or dangerous. Humanity had invented moral fashion policing, and the rules were often inconsistent. Some religions valued simplicity and modesty. Others embraced magnificent ceremonial clothing as proof of divine glory. One culture praised shaved heads, while another praised long hair. One society demanded veils, while another celebrated exposed skin in sacred R1. Tools Dash, which really highlights an important truth about human civilization. People can assign deep spiritual meaning to almost anything if given enough time. Still, religious clothing served an important purpose. It created identity, belonging, and continuity across generations. A robe, veil, or symbol connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Unfortunately, it also meant humanity entered another endless historical phase, arguing passionately about what everyone else should wear, a debate that thousands of years later, modern society continues with exhausting enthusiasm. Once clothing became tied to religion, status, and identity, it was only a matter of time before governments started interfering too. Because throughout history, rulers quickly realized something important. Controlling how people dress is often an easy way to control society itself, and humans absolutely love telling other humans what they are allowed to wear. Ancient governments introduced laws, regulati, ng fabrics, colors, jewelry, hairstyles, and decorations. These were known as sumptuary laws, and they existed across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East for centuries. Their purpose was simple: keep social classes visually separated. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, peasants were often forbidden from wearing luxurious materials like silk, velvet, or expensive fur. Certain colors were reserved for nobles or royalty. In some cities, only specific classes could wear gold embroidery or jeweled accessories. Imagine saving money your entire life for one nice outfit, only for the government to arrive and say, "Unfortunately, that fabric is above your tax bracket." And honestly, rulers were terrified of clothing for one major reason: appearance could blur social boundaries. If wealthy merchants dressed like nobles or ordinary people imitated aristocratic fashion, the entire social hierarchy became visually confusing. Clothing helped maintain order. Kings wanted peasants looking like peasants. Nobles wanted to appear obviously superior. Society depended heavily on everyone recognizing their place immediately from 50 feet away. Fashion became a form of political stability. This was especially true in empires. Roman officials wore specific togas marking rank and authority. Chinese dynasties regulated court dress in extraordinary detail. Japanese samurai followed strict clothing traditions tied to class and loyalty. Across civilizations, governments repeatedly used appearance to reinforce obedience. And naturally, people constantly broke these rules. For most of early history, clothing changed very slowly. A tunic remained a tunic for generations. A fur cloak stayed practical because freezing to death never really went out of style. But as civilizations grew richer and trade expanded, something strange happened. Humans began changing clothing deliberately just because they were bored. Fashion trends were born, and honestly, civilization has never emotionally recovered. From this development, once cities became wealthier, clothing evolved faster than ever before. New fabrics arrived from distant lands. Silk traveled along trade routes from China. Dyes became more sophisticated. Tailors experimented with cuts, sleeves, patterns, and decorations. Wealthy people suddenly had access to variety, and humanity immediately transformed that variety into competition. 1 year long robes became fashionable. The next year, shorter robes appeared. Shoes widened, narrowed, pointed, or thickened, depending entirely on the collective mood of society. Entire populations began replacing perfectly functional clothing simply because somebody important decided sleeves should look different now, which remains deeply impressive from a psychological standpoint. Ancient Rome saw dramatic fashion shifts between republican simplicity and imperial luxury. Medieval Europe became obsessed with pointed shoes so long some nobles struggled to walk properly. Renaissance elites competed through absurdly elaborate fabrics and bright colors. In some periods, men's hats became so enormous they practically deserved separate tax categories, and every generation believed their current fashion choices represented civilization at its peak. People also began mocking older styles aggressively. Clothing became tied to youth, relevance, and social belonging. Nobody wanted to look outdated. Imagine surviving famine, plague, war, and dangerous childbirth, only to be told your sleeves were no longer fashionable. Humanity's priorities have always been fascinating. Fashion trends also spread through imitation. Royals influenced nobles. Nobles influenced merchants. Merchants influenced commoners. Travelers carried styles between cities and kingdoms. Clothing became one of the earliest forms of mass cultural communication. And importantly, trends created industries. Tailors, dyers, weavers, jewelers, leather workers, and cloth merchants all benefited from constant demand for new styles. Fashion stopped being occasional decoration and became permanent economic machinery. Entire cities grew wealthy, producing textiles and luxury garments, which meant humanity had officially discovered consumer culture. People now purchased clothing not only because they needed it, but because they wanted social approval, admiration, attraction, or status. The emotional connection between identity and appearance became stronger with every century. And this process accelerated endlessly because once humans discovered they could reinvent themselves through clothing, fashion stopped being about protection entirely. It became aspiration, fantasy, performance. A poor man could dress like a wealthy man. A nervous person could appear powerful. A ruler could dress like a god, all through fabric. Which is remarkable when you remember this entire story began with exhausted prehistoric humans wrapping dead animal skin around themselves, because winter was becoming unbearable. As societies became more complex, clothing stopped being just about class or status. It also became one of humanity's favorite ways to separate men and women into carefully organized social roles. And history took this responsibility extremely seriously. Different cultures created strict expectations about how men should dress, how women should dress, what colors they could wear, how much skin they could show, how long their hair should be, and even how they were allowed to stand, walk, or sit while wearing certain garments. Humanity essentially turned fabric into a full-time behavioral instruction manual. In many ancient societies, men's clothing emphasized strength, authority, or military readiness. Women's clothing often emphasized modesty, fertility, beauty, or domestic roles. Loose robes, layered gowns, veils, jewelry, armor, belts, hairstyles, every detail slowly became connected to larger ideas about masculinity and femininity. And once societies establish appearance rules, people become deeply emotional about them almost immediately. In ancient Rome, respectable women wore garments different from prostitutes or enslaved women. Medieval Europe associated long, flowing hair with femininity and virtue. In some cultures, warriors wore highly decorative clothing that modern societies might consider flamboyant, proving once again that fashion rules are largely invented and change constantly depending on the century. High heels themselves originally became popular among aristocratic men before later shifting toward women's fashion, which means somewhere in history, a nobleman proudly walked through a palace in heels, while confidently believing future generations would absolutely understand his vision. They did not. Clothing also physically shaped behavior. Long skirts restricted movement. Heavy robes changed posture. Tight garments controlled body shape. Certain outfits made physical labor difficult, reinforcing social expectations about who should work and who should remain decorative. Victor. Orient women later perfected this concept by dressing themselves like beautiful but medically compromised furniture. But even in earlier eras, clothing often limited freedom intentionally. Restrictive garments symbolized wealth because they proved the wearer did not need practical mobility. If you could barely walk without assistance, congratulations society assumed you were rich enough to avoid useful tasks entirely. Men faced pressures too. Armor was heavy. Ceremonial uniforms were uncomfortable. Royal fashion could become absurdly elaborate. Across history, countless men quietly suffered inside layers of decorative fabric because appearing powerful mattered more than comfort, which really unites humanity beautifully. No matter the century, People consistently chose social approval over physical well-being. And perhaps that is why clothing became so emotionally important. Garments did not just cover the body anymore. They shaped identity itself. People learned how to behave, attract to, hers, gain respect, and fit into society, partly through clothing. By this point in history, humans were no longer simply wearing clothes. In many ways, the clothes were beginning to wear them. At some point, clothing stopped being mainly about survival, modesty, or social order, and became something else entirely: luxury. Humans had now reached the stage where fabric itself could become a display of wealth so extreme that entire fortunes were spent on garments designed mainly to impress other wealthy people standing nearby, pretending not to care. Civilization was progressing beautifully. As trade routes expanded across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, rare materials became highly valuable. Silk from China amazed foreign civilizations with its softness and shine. Fine cotton, velvet, lace, satin, and exotic dyes became symbols of status. Wealthy elites competed constantly through clothing, often wearing outfits so expensive they could have fed entire villages for months. But for eating peasants rarely sparkled under candlelight, so priorities remained clear. Silk became especially prized because producing it required enormous labor and long-distance trade. In some societies, only royalty or nobles could legally wear certain silks or colors. Merchants crossed deserts and oceans transporting luxury fabrics because humans are apparently willing to risk death for sufficiently attractive textiles. And honestly, they still are. Luxury fashion also became intentionally impractical. Long trains dragged through dirt. Sleeves widened to ridiculous proportions. Delicate fabrics tore easily. Massive wigs required constant maintenance. Clothing became less about function and more about proving the wearer lived above ordinary life. A wealthy person dressed in fragile white silk was essentially announcing, "I personally never carry anything heavier than political opinions." Jewelry expanded alongside luxury clothing. Gold embroidery, pearls, gemstones, silver thread, fur trim. Decorative buttons and elaborate lace transformed garments into walking displays of financial power. European courts became especially obsessed with excess. Kings and nobles competed endlessly through appearance, often changing outfits multiple times per day, which sounds exhausting, honestly. Ancient farmers probably owned one shirt and slept peacefully every night, while aristocrats suffered emotional breakdowns over ribbon coordination. Luxury clothing also created enormous industries. Entire cities specialized in weaving, dyeing, tailoring, embroidery, shoemaking, and jewelry production. Fashion became a major economic force connecting continents through trade networks. And naturally, counterfeit luxury appeared almost immediately. Cheaper imitations flooded markets as ordinary people tried copying elite styles without elite budgets. Humanity invented fake designer culture centuries before modern handbags. Some things truly never change. Perhaps the strangest part is how our luxury clothing became. Expensive garments represented aspiration, power, beauty, and social acceptance all at once. People risked debt, ridicule, and even punishment to appear wealthier through clothing, because by now, humanity had attached enormous psychological meaning to appearance. Clothing was no longer just something humans wore. It had become a dream people wrapped around themselves, hoping others would believe it too. By the time ancient civilizations grew into massive empires, clothing had become something far bigger than personal expression. It became a symbol of civilization itself. People judged entire cultures based on appearance. The Greeks and Romans often described foreign tribes as barbaric, partly because of how they dressed. To wealthy Romans, proper civilization meant clean tunics, arranged hairstyles, sandals, jewelry, and carefully maintained fabrics. Anyone wearing rough animal skins or unfamiliar clothing automatically appeared primitive, dangerous, or cultured, which is slightly ironic considering many Roman aristocrats spent hours being powdered, perfumed, and dressed by servants, while barbarians were outside surviving actual winters successfully. Still, appearance mattered enormously in ancient societies. Clothing represented order. A dressed body symbolized discipline, structure, and belonging to civilization. Nakedness became increasingly associated with poverty, savagery, punishment, or humiliation even, though humanity itself had spent most of its existence naked beside campfires, arguing over whose spear was missing. Empires also used clothing to spread cultural influence. When Rome conquered regions, Roman fashion spread alongside Roman language, architecture, and laws. Similar patterns appeared across Chinese dynasties, Islamic caliphates, and European colonial empires centuries later. Clothing became part of assimilation itself. Dress like the empire, behave like the empire, become the empire, and people often adapted quick. Because clothing carried opportunity. Wearing the dominant culture's fashion could improve status, trade access, political trust, or social acceptance. Appearance opened doors long before resumes existed. Military uniforms became especially important during this period. Armies needed visual unity. Soldiers dressed alike to create discipline, identity, and intimidation. Matching armor and colors transformed thousands of frightened individuals into something psychologically larger, which remains one of humanity's favorite tricks. Dressing groups identically until everyone feels more powerful. But civilizations also feared foreign clothing deeply. New styles from outside cultures could trigger panic, outrage, or accusations of moral decline. Throughout history, older generations repeatedly complained that younger people dressed strangely and society was collapsing because of it. Ancient Rome complained about excessive luxury. Medieval leaders attacked foreign fabrics. Later, Europeans panicked over changing hairstyles, trousers, cosmetics, and imported fashions. Humanity has apparently spent several thousand consecutive years saying, young people today are dressing incorrectly, and somehow civilization survives every time. By now, clothing had absorbed enormous meaning. It represented class, religion, morality, politics, civilization, and identity simultaneously. A simple garment could communicate where someone came from, what they believed, how wealthy they were, and whether society considered them respectable, which is remarkable when you remember how this entire story started. Early humans originally wore clothing because freezing naked in the snow was unpleasant. Everything after that became increasingly emotional, complicated, and occasionally ridiculous. By the modern era, humans had technically mastered clothing. We understood fabrics, tailoring, insulation, dyes, sewing, and mass production. Entire industries existed to create garments, safer, lighter, warmer, and more comfortable than anything our ancestors could imagine. Naturally, humanity immediately used this progress to invent deeply uncomfortable fashion trends all over again. Because despite thousands of years of technological advancement, human psychology remained remarkably consistent. People still wanted status, beauty, admiration, power, attraction, and belonging. Clothing continued serving emotional needs far beyond practicality, and modern fashion became faster, louder, and far more exhausting. Industrialization transformed clothing forever. Factories produced garments quickly and cheaply. Ordinary people suddenly gained access to styles once reserved for elites. Fashion trends spread rapidly through newspapers, magazines, photography, film, television, and eventually social media. Humanity entered the age of permanent comparison. In earlier centuries, trends might change slowly over decades. Modern fashion could reinvent itself every season. One year, trousers widened the number. Next year, they narrowed dramatically. Hairstyles rose upward, flattened downward, disappeared entirely, then returned 20 years later, pretending everything was new. And honestly, fashion history sometimes feels less like progress and more like humanity suffering from collective memory loss every generation. Modern societies also inherited many ancient ideas about clothing. Expensive fashion still signals wealth. Uniforms still represent authority. Formal clothing still communicates professionalism. Certain colors still carry emotional meaning. People continue judging intelligence, trustworthiness, attractiveness, and success within seconds based partly on appearance. Prehistoric humans wearing decorated animal skins beside fires would probably understand modern luxury brands immediately. Modern fashion also created entirely new forms of anxiety. Advertising convinced people they constantly needed new clothes, new trends, new body standards, and new identities. Clothing became tied to celebrity culture, consumerism, and self-worth in ways previous civilizations could barely imagine. And yet, the emotional core stayed the same. Humans still dress partly to survive weather, but also to feel accepted, admired, powerful, attractive, unique, or safe. A business suit, wedding dress, military uniform, leather jacket, luxury handbag, or favorite hoodie all carry emotional meaning beyond fabric itself. Clothing became part of how humans tell stories about themselves, which is fascinating when you remember the original reason humans started wearing clothes was probably much simpler. Ancient humans were cold. Everything else fashion shows, luxury brands, political symbolism, beauty standards, social judgment, impossible shoes, and billion-dollar industries slowly grew from one exhausted prehistoric person wrapping animal fur around their shoulders during winter and thinking, "This is slightly better." So after thousands of years of history, fashion trends, religious rules, luxury fabrics, impossible beauty standards, political symbolism, and emotionally devastating shoe choices, what was the real reason humans started wearing clothes? Survival. At its core, clothing began because humans evolved into strangely vulnerable creatures. We lost our fur, expanded into colder climates, and discovered that freezing to death was deeply inconvenient for long-term survival plans. Clothing protected the body from cold, rain, sun, insects, injuries, and harsh environments. Without it, humanity could never have spread across much of the planet. The first clothes were not fashionable. They were practical solutions created by tired people, trying not to die. And honestly, that makes the entire story even more fascinating because once humans solved the basic survival problem, clothing immediately became attached to nearly every emotional and social instinct we possess. Status, attraction, fear, identity, politics, rebellion, wealth, shame, belonging, power. Clothing evolved. Alongside civilization itself, a fur cloak became a status symbol. A robe became sacred. A uniform became authority. A crown became divine power. A suit became professionalism. A hoodie became, "Leave me alone. I do not wish to participate in society today." Every era layered new meaning onto clothing until garments stopped being just objects entirely. They became emotional armor. Humans learned to communicate silently through appearance. Clothing told others who belonged, who ruled, who worked, who fought, who mourned, who worshipped, who obeyed, and who rebelled. Entire lives could change based on fabric, color, or style, which is remarkable for a species that originally just wanted warmer legs during winter. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Despite all our technology and progress, modern humans still behave very similarly to our ancestors. People still dress for survival, comfort, attraction, status, identity, and approval all at once. We still use clothing to impress strangers, join groups, signal success, or protect insecurities. Ancient humans decorated animal hides with beads. Modern humans buy luxury sneakers costing more than medieval farmland. The emotional logic is disturbingly similar. Even today, clothing affects confidence, social treatment, opportunity, and belonging. People feel embarrassed by the wrong outfit, empowered by the right one, judged for appearance, or comforted by familiar clothing. Fabric still shapes human psychology thousands of years after the first stitched hide appeared beside an Ice Age fire. So in the end, humans did not start wearing clothes because of modesty alone or beauty alone. We started wearing clothes because nature forced us to adapt. Everything after that, fashion empires, royal wardrobes, social judgment, impossible trends, and billion-dollar luxury industries came from one uniquely human habit: taking a practical idea and turning it into something emotionally complicated forever. Long before the wedding feast itself began, the first real sign of marriage in ancient Gaul arrived on creaking wooden wagons, dragged through muddy village roads by exhausted oxen that clearly had not volunteered, ready for this level of commitment. The groom's family appeared at sunrise carrying gifts meant to impress the bride's relatives and, more importantly, prevent a public argument before breakfast. The village gathered immediately. Gauls loved spectacle almost as much as they loved salted pork and loudly discussing other people's business. Men pretending to repair fences somehow positioned themselves directly beside the road. Women carrying baskets mysteriously stopped walking the moment the procession appeared. Children ran alongside the wagons hoping something would fall off. Sometimes it did. The gifts themselves were not romantic in the modern sense. Nobody arrived with flowers and handwritten poetry about eternal devotion beneath moonlit skies. Ancient Gauls preferred practical demonstrations of wealth. If a man wished to marry, he showed he could contribute livestock, grain, weapons, drinking vessels, fine cloth, or silver jewelry. Nothing says, "I cherish your daughter," quite like 6 squealing pigs and a barrel of ale large enough to incapacitate a small tribe. At the center of the procession stood the groom's father, attempting to look dignified while negotiating with the bride's family. He discussed alliances, property, family obligations, and future children, while everyone nearby quietly judged the quality of his cloak. In Gaul, reputation mattered enormously. A wealthy appearance could strengthen alliances, even if half the decorative brooches had been borrowed from cousins the previous evening. Ancient society ran partly on honor and partly on what today would probably be called aggressive bluffing. Meanwhile, the bride remained mostly inside the family home, surrounded by female relatives preparing her for the ceremony ahead. Older women braided her hair, adjusted jewelry, and offered advice about marriage that ranged from genuinely wise to deeply alarming. One aunt explained how to manage household servants. Another warned her never to trust drunk warriors. Aching promises during winter festivals. This was excellent advice because drunk warriors in ancient Gaul promised absolutely everything. Outside, preparations for the feast had already begun. Fires were lit near the center of the settlement. Slaves and servants hauled water from nearby streams, while hunters unloaded deer carcasses beside tables covered in herbs and onions. The smell of smoke slowly spread through the village air, and as the sun climbed higher above the forests of Gaul, everyone understood the same thing. Tonight would not simply be a wedding. It would be a performance of wealth, power, loyalty, and survival, disguised as a feast with too much ale. As the negotiations between the families settled into cautious smiles and exaggerated compliments, the real work of the wedding feast began. Ancient Gaulish weddings were not delicate little gatherings with polite conversation and tiny portions arranged artistically on wooden plates. This was a tribal feast. The objective was not simply to feed guests. The objective was to convince everyone present that your family possessed enough wealth and influence to survive winter, win wars, and casually roast half a forest's wildlife in a single evening. Before dawn had fully broken, servants and relatives were already outside building enormous cooking fires near the center of the settlement. Men hacked apart logs with iron axes while smoke drifted through the cold morning air. Sparks flew upward into the grey sky as women carried baskets of onions, leeks, herbs, and barley toward long wooden tables darkened by years of knife marks and spilled ale. The butchering began shortly afterward. Several pigs squealed in protest before meeting the deeply unfortunate reality of ancient culinary traditions. Deer carcasses were skinned beside the fires, while hunters proudly exaggerated the difficulty of the hunt to anyone willing to listen. According to one warrior, the deer had nearly killed him. The deer itself, now upside down, owned beside a chopping block, was unavailable for comment. Large iron cauldrons were suspended over the flames, using heavy chains blackened from years of smoke. Inside them, thick stews slowly formed from meat, barley, garlic, and wild herbs gathered from nearby forests. The smell spread across the village so intensely that children kept wandering dangerously close to the fires, hoping to steal scraps before the feast officially began. Most were chased away by elderly women armed with spoons and terrifying authority. Meanwhile, the ale barrels were rolled into position near the feast tables. This part of the preparation attracted immediate attention from the warriors. Gauls were famous across the ancient world for many things: bravery, elaborate mustaches, and drinking with the emotional restraint of collapsing siege equipment. Roman writers complained endlessly about it, which naturally encouraged the Gauls to continue. Near the edge of the settlement, druids quietly blessed portions of, if the food and drink. Offerings were set aside for the gods, because inviting divine anger to a wedding feast was considered poor planning. Nobody wanted a cursed marriage before the second cup of ale. And by midday, the village no longer smelled like wet earth and smoke. It smelled like roasted meat, boiling stew, spilled drink, and rising celebration, the kind of smell that told every traveler for miles around that tonight nobody in this settlement would be sleeping early. While the feast fires roared outside and warriors sampled ale they were absolutely not supposed to touch yet, the bride remained inside the family home, preparing for the ceremony itself. This process took hours, partly because ritual mattered deeply in ancient Gaul, and partly because no gathering involving extended relatives had ever moved efficiently in human history. The small wooden house buzzed with activity. Female relatives crowded around the bride, adjusting jewelry, tightening belts, and arguing over fabric. CS with the intensity of military commanders planning a siege. One aunt insisted the blue wool shawl symbolized prosperity. Another claimed it made the bride look pale. A third woman contributed nothing except criticism of a sacred family tradition stretching back thousands of years. The bride's clothing reflected both status and tribal identity. Fine-dyed wool was expensive, especially colors like deep blue, green, or red, which required costly natural dyes and skilled labor. Bronze bracelets decorated her wrists, while heavy necklaces rested against her chest. Some wealthier families displayed imported ornaments traded through distant routes, connecting Gaul to Rome and beyond. Nothing impressed neighboring tribes quite like casually wearing jewelry from lands they could not pronounce. Her hair was carefully braided and pinned using metal clasps polished until they reflected firelight. Perfumed oils made from herbs and flowers were rubbed into the braids to mask the less glamorous reality. Ease of Iron Age village life. Ancient Gaul smelled many things on a daily basis: smoke, livestock, wet leather, sweat, brewing ale, muddy dogs, and occasionally victory. Lavender helped where it could. Meanwhile, the groom prepared separately with the men of his family. Compared to the bride's careful preparation, this process was dramatically simpler. Warriors inspected his cloak, adjusted his belt, handed him ceremonial jewelry, and told him not to embarrass himself during the feast. Several older men immediately followed this advice by becoming drunk before noon. Outside, musicians tested horns and drums near the feast area. The deep sound echoed across the settlement, while children chased one another between the tables. Dogs wandered beneath benches, searching for scraps before the food had even arrived. Somewhere nearby, two cousins started wrestling for reasons neither of them fully understood anymore. As the afternoon sun lowered above the forests, the atmosphere slowly changed. What had begun as preparation now felt ceremonial. Guests gathered closer to the center of the village. Druids moved quietly among the families. The fires crackled louder against the cooling air, and inside the crowded family home, the bride finally stood ready, dressed not only for marriage but for a public union that could shape alliances, wealth, and family power for generations to come. As evening approached, the ceremony finally moved outside. The fires burned brighter now against the darkening sky, sending waves of smoke above the rooftops, while the entire village gathered near the central clearing. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, not the marriage itself, necessarily. Ancient Gauls respected marriage, of course. but they respected public spectacle even more. The procession began with musicians. Men carrying long bronze horns stepped forward first, blowing deep notes that echoed across the surrounding forests. Drummers followed behind them, striking heavy rhythms. That vibrated through the ground beneath the crowd's feet. Children immediately became overexcited and started running in circles. One elderly villager complained about the noise despite having attended identical ceremonies for the past 50 years. Behind the musicians came the groom and his family. He wore a heavy wool cloak fastened with polished brooches, a decorated belt, and jewelry meant to display status without appearing too desperate. This balance was important. Looking poor embarrassed your family. Looking too rich encouraged neighboring tribes to invade you later. The groom walked carefully through the crowd while warriors slapped his shoulders and shouted jokes about married life. Most of these jokes suggested he would soon lose all freedom, authority, and possibly ownership of his own blankets. Marriage humor, it turns out, has survived remarkably well across human civilization. Then the bride emerged. The crowd quieted almost immediately as she stepped from her family home. Me, surrounded by female relatives carrying lanterns and ceremonial offerings. Firelight reflected against her bronze jewelry, while her dyed clothing stood out brightly against the smoky evening air. Even the drunken warriors managed temporary silence, which may have been the most impressive ritual of the entire ceremony. The bride's father guided her toward the center of the settlement, where the druids waited beside the fires. Offerings of bread, ale, and meat had already been placed near a small sacred altar decorated with branches and carved symbols. Marriage in ancient Gaul was not simply a personal union. It carried spiritual importance tied to family honor, tribal stability, and the favor of the gods. As the couple stood together before the gathered villagers, the druids began chanting prayers in low rhythmic voices. Smoke drifted upward through the trees while torches flickered around the crowd. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the settlement, dogs barked at sounds nobody else could hear. And for a brief moment, beneath the noise, music, and smell of roasted meat, the wedding felt ancient even to the people living inside it, a tradition repeated generation after generation, long before Rome arrived with its roads, taxes, and deeply exhausting opinions about everyone else's culture. Once the procession reached the center of the village, the celebration shifted from noisy spectacle into sacred ritual, at least for a little while. Ancient Gauls were capable of solemn ceremonies, although maintaining silence near several barrels of ale was always an ambitious strategy. The druids stood waiting beside the fires, dressed in long robes stained with smoke and years of ritual use. Their presence carried enormous authority. In Gaulish society, druids acted as priests, judges, scholars, advisors, and occasionally, the only people capable of stopping tribal leaders from making catastrophically stupid decisions. Even warriors lowered their voices when the rituals began. Bride and groom were guided toward a small altar built from stone and oak branches. Sacred objects rested upon it. Bowls of grain, carved drinking vessels, animal bones, and bundles of herbs tied together with leather cords. Nearby, offerings of bread and roasted meat were prepared for the gods. Refusing to honor the gods before a marriage was considered an excellent way to invite disease, bad harvests, or relatives who stayed far too long after the wedding. The druid leading the ceremony raised his hands toward the crowd and began chanting prayers in the old Celtic tongue. The words rolled slowly through the evening air, while smoke drifted upward from the fires into the darkening sky. Most villagers listened respectfully. A few younger warriors quietly struggled to remain awake after spending the afternoon testing the ale barrels for safety purposes. The couple exchanged symbolic gifts before the gathered tribe. The groom offered metal jewelry and finely crafted items representing page, protection, and prosperity. The bride presented woven cloth and household goods symbolizing fertility, loyalty, and the joining of families. Marriage in ancient Gaul was not viewed as simple romance. It was an alliance, a merging of resources, bloodlines, obligations, and survival itself. At one point, both families shared ceremonial cups of ale passed carefully between them. This public act mattered deeply. Sharing drinks symbolized trust and mutual loyalty. Of course, this also conveniently allowed everyone nearby to continue drinking during the sacred ritual, which greatly improved public enthusiasm for religion. Then came the vows. The promises were spoken aloud before the tribe, the ancestors, and the gods. The couple swore loyalty to one another and to the families now joined together through marriage. Nearby torches flickered in the wind while the crowd listened in unusual silence. And as the final prayers ended, the atmosphere in the village subtly changed once again. The sacred duties were complete. The gods had been honored. The marriage had been witnessed. Now came the part everyone truly excelled at, the feast. The moment the druids completed the final blessing, the entire atmosphere of the village changed with almost terrifying speed. Sacred silence vanished instantly beneath laughter, shouting, music, and the unmistakable sound of several warriors racing toward the ale barrels like starving wolves spotting wounded livestock. The wedding feast had officially begun. Servants carried enormous platters of roasted meat toward the long wooden tables arranged around the fires. Whole pigs glistened beneath layers of herbs and dripping fat, while deer meat roasted slowly over open flames. Bowls of thick barley stew steamed beside fresh bread, onions, apples, nuts, and soft white cheese wrapped in cloth. The smell alone could probably end small wars temporarily. Guests crowded together, shoulder to shoulder, along the benches. Tribal leaders sat closest to the bride and groom, naturally placing themselves near the best portions of food entirely by coincidence. They insisted. Warriors argued loudly over seating while children crawled beneath tables, stealing scraps before dogs could reach them first. The dogs, meanwhile, had accepted this challenge personally. Large drinking horns filled with ale passed constantly between guests. Gauls were famous drinkers throughout the ancient world, a fact Roman writers described with a mixture of horror and fascination. Roman authors often portrayed Gauls as wild barbarians incapable of moderation. To be fair, observing this wedding feast from a distance would not have strengthened Rome's counter-argument. Music thundered through the settlement. Horn players blasted long notes into the night, while drummers hammered rhythms around the fires. Some guests began dancing almost immediately, spinning around the clearing with enough enthusiasm to make nearby tables structurally nervous. One elderly warrior attempted to leap over a bench, failed completely, and blamed the uneven ground, despite the ground having remained perfectly stationary all evening. At the center of the celebration sat the bride and groom, now expected to host guests while surviving endless attention from both families. Relatives approached constantly offering blessings, advice, gifts, or deeply uncomfortable comments about future children. Ancient weddings across many civilizations shared one universal feature. Subtlety did not exist. As darkness fully settled across the forests surrounding the village, torchlight flickered against shields, jewelry, and drinking horns. Smoke rose into the cold night air, while laughter echoed between the wooden homes. And beneath all the noise and celebration, the feast served an important purpose beyond food and drink. This was not simply a party. It was a public display of tribal unity, wealth, loyalty, and strength. Every full table and overflowing ale cup announced the same message to the Wa. To King World, this family was prosperous enough to feed an entire village for a night, and in ancient Gaul, that kind of power mattered almost as much as victory in battle. As the feast continued deeper into the night, the carefully organized celebration slowly transformed into something far less organized and far more Gaulish. The tables became louder, the songs became less accurate, and the warriors became increasingly convinced they were gifted dancers, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The musicians stood near the center, surrounded by cheering guests. Bronze horns echoed through the settlement, while drums pounded steady rhythms beneath the night sky. Wooden flutes added sharp melodies over the noise of conversation, laughter, barking dogs, and the occasional sound of someone dropping an entire drinking horn onto the ground, after dramatically emphasizing a story that absolutely did not happen the way they claimed. Dancing began shortly after the third or fourth round of ale. Men and women formed circles around the fires, stomping their feet against the earth, while musicians increased the tempo. Some dances carried ritual meaning connected to fertility, prosperity, or tribal unity. Others appeared to involve spinning violently until someone lost balance and collided with nearby furniture. Ancient cultural traditions often contained both dignity and concussion risks simultaneously. The younger warriors quickly turned the celebration into a competition. One man attempted to dance while balancing a spear across his shoulders. Another challenged friends to leap over sections of the fire. The druids immediately disapproved of this behavior, mostly because they preferred not to explain accidental wedding deaths to the gods afterward. Meanwhile, older villagers sat along the edges of the feast, sharing stories beside the torchlight. Veterans described ancient battles in increasingly exaggerated detail, while children listened wide-eyed around them. According to one gray-haired warrior, he had personally defeated 12 enemies during a single battle, despite standing barely taller than the average bread loaf. Nobody questioned him. Respect for elders was important in Gaulish society, as was avoiding long arguments with drunk men carrying axes. At the center table, the bride and groom continued receiving endless attention from guests. Relatives toasted their future prosperity every few minutes, ensuring the couple consumed enough ale to temporarily forget most of the evening by sunrise. One elderly aunt loudly demanded grandchildren before the musicians had even finished the second dance. Outside the ring of firelight, the forests surrounding the village remained dark and silent. But inside the settlement, warmth and noise filled every corner. Smoke drifted upward into the cold night, while sparks floated through the air like glowing insects. And as the drums thundered louder beneath the stars, the wedding feast became exactly what ancient Gaulish celebrations were meant to be. Part sacred tradition, part political gathering, and part complete public chaos, fueled by roasted meat and heroic levels of alcohol consumption. As the night stretched onward and the fires burned lower beneath the stars, the wedding feast slowly entered a different phase. The loudest dancing had begun to fade. Several warriors had reached the advanced stages of drunken philosophy, and somewhere near the ale barrels, two cousins were arguing passionately over whose goat had once bitten a Roman merchant harder. Nobody entirely understood how the argument started, including the cousins themselves. But while much of the village celebrated openly, important conversations were unfolding quietly around the edges of the feast. Ancient Gaulish weddings were not only family events, they were political opportunities. Near the center tables, tribal elders exchanged gifts beneath the torchlight, while servants carried more food and drink between them. Fine clothes. AKs, decorated brooches, silver coins, hunting spears, carved cups, and imported goods from distant trade routes changed hands throughout the evening. Every gift carried meaning beyond generosity. A necklace might symbolize loyalty between families. A weapon could represent military support during future conflicts. Even livestock communicated wealth and trust. Or in simpler terms, ancient weddings were partially diplomacy with roasted pork. The bride's father moved carefully between guests, speaking with allied families and neighboring clan leaders. Marriage strengthened bonds between tribes, reduced tensions, and created obligations that could last generations. A successful union might guarantee military aid during war or secure access to trade routes and farmland. One poorly handled alliance, meanwhile, could create blood feuds lasting longer than the average human lifespan. Ancient politics tended to be emotionally exhausting. Meanwhile, merchants attending the feast quietly observe everything. Traders from nearby settlements used gatherings like this to establish connections and negotiate future deals. Wine imported from the south, jewelry from distant tribes, salt thurs, and iron tools all circulated through these conversations. A wedding feast in Gaul could easily become half marketplace by midnight. At another table, druids spoke softly with village leaders while studying the behavior of the crowd. Maintaining harmony inside a tribe mattered enormously. Public celebrations reinforced loyalty and social order. Feasting together reminded everyone that survival depended on cooperation, especially during harsh winters or coming wars. The bride and groom themselves had become symbols of this unity. Everywhere they walked, guests raised drinking horns toward them. Songs were sung in their honor, while older relatives offered blessings for prosperity, strong children, and healthy harvests. One particularly drunk warrior loudly wished them at least 10 sons, which circa AWS'd nearby women to laugh so hard one nearly dropped her cup into the fire. And beneath the music, smoke, and endless noise of celebration, the real purpose of the feast became unmistakably clear. This marriage was not just joining two people together. It was binding an entire community. By the final hours of the feast, the wedding celebration had drifted into the strange, half-conscious atmosphere that only appears after an entire village spends the night eating roasted meat, drinking endless ale, and shouting over drums for 6 consecutive hours. The fires had burned low now, glowing red beneath layers of ash, while smoke curled quietly into the cold night sky. Many guests still sat around the tables wrapped in heavy wool cloaks, their voices slower and rougher than before. Others had already fallen asleep wherever gravity finally defeated them, beside benches, against walls, underneath tables, and in one unfortunate case, directly beside a goat that seemed equally confused by the situation. The musicians continued playing, although with noticeably less enthusiasm than earlier in the evening. One horn player missed several notes entirely and pretended it was intentional artistic expression. The drummers slowed their rhythms, while dancers stumbled through exhausted final movements around the fires. At the edge of the settlement, older women cleaned wooden platters, while servants collected empty drinking vessels scattered across the ground. Dogs wandered triumphantly between the tables, devouring scraps abandoned during the feast. Somewhere nearby, a warrior loudly swore eternal friendship to a man whose name he had forgotten halfway through the sentence. Near the center fire, the bride and groom remained surrounded by close family members. The formal rituals were complete now, but ancient Gaulish weddings often continued deep into the night with storytelling, blessings, and final offerings to the gods. Elder relatives spoke quietly about ancestors, family honor, and the responsibilities awaiting the newly married couple. Marriage was not viewed as personal happiness alone. It meant duty to family, tribe, land, and future generations. Before the celebration finally ended, the druids approached the couple one last time to offer closing prayers beside the dying fires. Small offerings of grain and ale were poured into the flames as thanks to the gods for protecting the union. The crowd fell unusually silent while sparks drifted upward into the darkness above the village, and for a brief moment the exhausted settlement seemed peaceful. No drums, no shouting, no drunken wrestling matches beside livestock, just smoke rising into the cold air while families sat together beneath the stars. By sunrise, the village would return to ordinary life. Warriors would wake with headaches strong enough to challenge spiritual belief itself. Servants would clean the remains of the feast. Farmers would return to fields and livestock. The excitement would slowly fade in, onto memory. But for one night, deep within the forests of ancient Gaul, an entire community had gathered around firelight to celebrate survival, loyalty, family, and tradition. And like most great ancient feasts, it ended with too much ale, exhausted musicians, and at least one man sleeping beside a goat for reasons history never fully explained. Long before the sun rose above the domes and towers of Constantinople, the harbor markets were already alive with noise. The city never truly slept. It simply changed shifts. While nobles rested behind silk curtains and guarded walls, the docks below exploded into motion beneath torchlight. Sea air, and the smell of 10,000 future meals waiting to be sold before noon. Ships crowded the harbors from every corner of the known world. Byzantine grain vessels arrived beside Arab trading ships. Venetian merchants, fishing boats from the Black Sea, and creaking cargo vessels overloaded with olives, wine, spices, and occasionally rats large enough to demand docking fees themselves. Sailors shouted from deck to dock, while dock workers hauled cargo through the muddy waterfront streets using ropes, carts, and levels of back pain modern medicine would describe as extremely concerning. Fish merchants were usually the first to begin selling. Fresh catches spilled across wooden stalls, still wet from seawater. Tuna, sardines, mackerel, eel, and shellfish glistened beneath oil lamps, while sellers screamed prices loud enough to challenge military commands. Customers pushed through the crowds carrying baskets and clay jars while arguing aggressively over quality, despite knowing full well they would buy the fish anyway. In Constantinople, bargaining was less about saving money and more about maintaining cultural traditions of mutual irritation. Nearby, bakers carried fresh bread through the streets, balanced on wooden trays. The smell drifted through the harbor air almost immediately, cutting through smoke, sweat, wet rope, and the deep. Why suspicious odor produced by certain sections of the docks during summer? Flatbread, sesame loaves, and sweet pastries disappeared quickly into the hands of laborers, beginning another exhausting day in the empire's capital. The market streets themselves were chaotic rivers of movement. Monks walked beside soldiers. Wealthy officials squeezed past fishermen covered in scales and salt water. Translators shouted between merchants speaking Greek, Latin, Armenian, Arabic, and enough other languages to make the entire harbor sound like civilization itself was arguing with itself. And everywhere there was food. Olives piled high in woven baskets, dates from the east, honey jars sealed with wax, wine barrels rolled across the stones while roasted nuts crackled above small street fires. Somewhere nearby, a lamb slowly turned over glowing coals while exhausted workers stared at it with the emotional intensity usually reserved for religious visions, because feeding Constantinople was not a small task. This was one of the largest cities on earth, crowded with merchants, sailors, priests, nobles, soldiers, laborers, beggars, and travelers from 3 continents. And every single one of them expected breakfast, as the harbor markets filled with shouting merchants and exhausted sailors. Another part of Constantinople had already been awake for hours: the bakeries. Bread was not simply food in the Byzantine capital. Bread was survival. Bread was politics. Bread was the fragile thread, preventing several 100,000 hungry citizens from collectively deciding to overthrow somebody important before lunchtime. Emperors understood this very well. A city deprived of bread became extremely creative in expressing public dissatisfaction. Before dawn, the bakeries scattered across Constantinople glowed with firelight. Massive ovens burned through the night while workers hauled sacks of grain, kneaded dough, and carried water through smoke-filled rooms hotter than theological arguments at imperial church councils, which in Byzantium was saying something impressive. Inside the bakeries, laborers moved with brutal efficiency. Dough was slapped onto wooden tables, rolled flat, shaped into loaves, and shoved into stone ovens blackened by years of heat and ash. Sweat poured down the faces of bakers, while flour coated their clothing so completely they looked less like workers and more like angry ghosts haunting bread professionally. The smell drifting through the streets was extraordinary. Fresh sesame bread, honey pastries, flat loaves brushed with oil, and warm wheat rolls filled entire neighborhoods with the scent of breakfast before sunrise had fully reached the city walls. Citizens emerged from cramped apartments carrying baskets and coins, hoping to buy fresh bread before supplies ran low. Because in a city this large, hesitation often meant eating yesterday's leftover fate many Byzantines considered personally offensive. Near the busiest markets, thread sellers shout over one another while balancing trays piled dangerously high with steaming loaves. Children ran between the crowds, carrying small purchases home for their families. Monks bought simple dark bread, while wealthy households sent servants to secure softer white loaves made from finer flour. Even bread itself reflected social hierarchy. Constantinople had somehow turned carbohydrates into class warfare. Meanwhile, imperial officials quietly monitored grain supplies throughout the city. Feeding Constantinople required enormous shipments of wheat arriving constantly from across the empire. One failed harvest or disrupted trade route could send prices soaring overnight. Riots over bread shortages had erupted before, and Byzantine crowds possessed a remarkable talent for becoming violently political with almost no warning whatsoever. Outside one bakery, laborers crowded around a vendor selling hot bread dipped in olive oil and herbs. Nearby, a sailor devoured an entire loaf while leaning against cargo crates beside the harbor. Two stray dogs watched him with desperate concentration, usually associated with battlefield survival. And as the morning sun slowly illuminated the golden rooftops and crowded streets of Constantinople, fresh bread continued pouring from the ovens into the hands of a city that never stopped eating, bargaining, praying, working, or complaining loudly about food prices. As fresh bread disappeared into the streets of Constantinople by the thousands, the market districts entered their busiest hours of the morning. The narrow avenues surrounding the forums and harbors became packed with merchants selling olives, spices, oils, dried fruits, and luxuries transported across half the known world. Constantinople was not merely a city. It was the center of an empire balanced directly between Europe and Asia, and its markets reflected that reality every single day. The olive sellers occupied some of the loudest sections of the market. Large clay jars stood beside wooden stalls overflowing with green, black, salted and oil-cured olives gathered from across the Mediterranean. Merchants shouted prices while offering samples to passing customers using small wooden picks. Buyers squeezed olives between their fingers, inspected color and texture, and argued over quality with the seriousness of military negotiations. One elderly woman spent nearly 20 minutes accusing a merchant of watering down his olive oil before purchasing it anyway. Nearby, spice traders transformed entire sections of the market into clouds of color and scent. Piles of saffron, cumin, cinnamon, pepper, coriander, and cloves covered long tables beneath hanging fabrics designed to block the harsh sun. Some spices arrived through trade routes stretching all the way toward India and Arabia. Others came through caravans crossing deserts, mountains, and territories where bandits considered theft less a crime and more a respectable career path. The wealthy citizens of Constantinople loved imported spices because nothing displayed status quite like casually seasoning dinner with ingredients transported across continents at enormous expense. A noblewoman sprinkling pepper onto roasted lamb was essentially announcing, "Yes, my household can afford flavor from 3 empires away." Meanwhile, ordinary workers crowded around cheaper stalls selling garlic, onions, herbs, nuts, figs, and dates. Vendors sliced dried fruit with small iron knives, while children carrying baskets pushed through the crowds, hoping not to lose coins entrusted to them by impatient parents back home. The streets themselves became almost impossible to navigate. Donkeys loaded with cargo, squeezed between soldiers, priests, fishermen, sailors, and merchants from distant lands. Greek mixed with Arabic, Armenian, Latin, and countless regional dialects until the marketplace sounded less like a city and more like the entire Mediterranean Sea trying to conduct business simultaneously. Above all of it hung the smell. Olive oil, warm bread, sea salt, roasting meat, incense, wine, spices, sweat, smoke, and animals blended together beneath the morning heat. It was overwhelming, noisy, crowded, and deeply alive. And for the people of Constantinople, this chaos was perfectly normal because feeding one of the greatest cities on earth required an empire-sized appetite and a marketplace loud enough to match it. As the spice market swelled with crowds and arguments over olive prices reached levels normally associated with border disputes, the smell of roasting meat began spreading through the streets of Constantinople. By midday, the city transformed into a giant open-air kitchen feeding hundreds of thousands of people who all seemed convinced they personally deserved the freshest food available within the empire. Street food vendors lined the busiest roads near the forums, harbors, and marketplaces. Smoke drifted upward from iron grills while cooks turned skewers of lamb above glowing company. As blackened by years of grease and ash, fat hissed into the flames as customers gathered nearby, staring at the meat with exhausted desperation. Constantinople was a city built on trade, religion, politics, and apparently the universal human instinct to stop functioning rationally near roasted lamb. Vendors shouted constantly to attract attention. Every seller claimed their food was the best in the district. Most were lying, but loudly and confidently, which in large cities often mattered more. Workers crowded around portable food stalls, carrying clay bowls filled with lentil soup, onions, beans, and chunks of bread dipped into oily broth. Sailors fresh from the docks devoured grilled fish with their bare hands, while merchants balanced meals and business negotiations simultaneously. Somewhere nearby, a tax official ate honey pastries, while pretending not to notice several vendors quietly avoiding payment. One of the most popular foods came from small carts selling flatbreads stuffed with herbs, cheese, or chopped meat. These meals were cheap, filling, and easy to carry through crowded streets. In other words, the medieval equivalent of grabbing something quickly before returning to 12 more hours of labor and public stress. The taverns near the harbor became especially crowded during the afternoon. Wine sellers rolled barrels through narrow streets, while exhausted dock workers packed inside dark taverns filled with smoke and arguments. Sailors from different regions exchanged stories, insults, and occasionally punches over cups of diluted wine. The Byzantine authorities technically preferred order. Constantinople itself preferred noise. Meanwhile, the wealthy citizens of the city enjoyed very different versions of market food. Rich households purchased expensive cuts of meat, imported sauces, spices, and pastries prepared by skilled cooks. Nobles walked through the same markets as ordinary citizens, but experienced them from a safe distance behind servants, RDs, and expensive perfume, attempting heroically to defeat the smell of fish. Above the streets, gulls circled the harbor, while church bells echoed across the city. And below them, Constantinople continued eating relentlessly, loudly, and in quantities large enough to make feeding the ancient world's greatest cities seem only slightly less difficult than invading them. As afternoon settled over Constantinople and the market streets reached their loudest point of the day, the wine sellers took control of the city's social life. Bread fed the population. Meat satisfied hunger. But wine kept the empire talking, negotiating, celebrating, arguing, and occasionally making extremely poor decisions with impressive confidence. The wine merchants moved constantly through the streets, with barrels strapped to carts, pulled by exhausted donkeys. Some sold local wines from nearby Byzantine vineyards, while wealthier traders offered expensive imports arriving from islands across the Aegean or distant Mediterranean ports. Tavern owners inspected the barrels carefully before buying, tasting samples with the seriousness of priests examining sacred relics. Byzantines drank wine daily, although usually diluted with water. Undiluted wine was considered excessive, uncivilized, or something barbarians probably did before falling into rivers. Of course, after several cups inside the harbor taverns, many citizens quietly abandoned these refined cultural standards altogether. The taverns themselves overflowed during the afternoon hours. Near the docks, sailors packed shoulder to shoulder inside dark rooms thick with smoke, sweat, spilled wine, and arguments conducted at full volume. Wooden tables shook beneath clay cups and greasy plates, while merchants negotiated trade deals beside laborers complaining about taxes, weather, or whichever emperor currently occupied the throne. In Constantinople, political dissatisfaction spread through taverns faster than plague, and usually with even louder shouting. Wine sellers moved between the tables, refilling cups while musicians played stringed instruments near the walls. Some taverns hosted gamblers tossing dice across worn wooden boards. Others attracted storytellers describing distant lands, sea monsters, battles, or miraculous adventures that became dramatically less believable the more wine everyone consumed. Outside, smaller wine stalls lined the market streets for citizens unwilling to spend hours inside taverns. Workers stopped for quick drinks between errands, while wealthy officials purchased expensive vintages carried home by servants. Even monks occasionally appeared near the wine markets, although they generally attempted to look spiritually conflicted about it. Meanwhile, the harbour district grew even more crowded as evening approached. Sailors unloaded final shipments before sunset, while fishmongers tried desperately to sell whatever remained from the morning catch. Roasted meat still crackled above street fires. West. Heil bakers carried out late trays of bread for the evening crowds. And through all of it flowed wine. Cheap wine, expensive wine, sweet wine, sour wine, wine diluted responsibly, and wine consumed with the judgment of a collapsing staircase. Because Constantinople was not merely a city of emperors, churches, and golden palaces. It was also a city where millions of conversations, arguments, friendships, and business deals began with someone saying, "Sit down for a moment. Have a drink." Behind the glittering spice stalls, overflowing taverns, and wealthy merchants bargaining over imported luxuries, Constantinople faced a far more difficult challenge every single day, feeding the enormous mass of ordinary people packed inside its walls. Because the capital of the Byzantine Empire was crowded, extremely crowded. Narrow streets twisted between apartment blocks stacked several floors high, filled with laborers, widows, sailors, craftsmen, servants, beggars, monks, refugees, and families eased into tiny rooms above noisy alleyways. Smoke drifted constantly between the buildings, while laundry hung overhead like surrender flags from an exhausted civilization. And every morning, these people needed food. The cheaper market districts near the poorer neighborhoods operated differently from the polished commercial areas visited by nobles and foreign diplomats. Here sellers shouted even louder. Portions were smaller, and bargaining became less of a cultural pastime and more of a survival skill. A single copper coin might determine whether a family ate fresh bread or stale scraps soaked in thin soup for another evening. Street vendors catered directly to the working poor. Huge cauldrons of lentils, onions, beans, and barley stew simmered above open fires, while exhausted laborers lined up carrying cracked bowls and rough bread. Fish too small or damaged for wealthier customers was salted heavily and sold cheaply near the docks. Vendors fried small cakes made from grain and oil, while children hovered nearby, hoping for leftovers or dropped crumbs. The city authorities understood the danger of hunger very well. Constantinople had experienced riots before, and hungry crowds inside a giant imperial capital tended to become dramatic quickly. Grain shipments arriving by sea were carefully monitored because one disrupted supply line could send food prices exploding overnight. An empire could survive foreign enemies. It struggled considerably more against several 100,000 angry citizens demanding bread. Religious institutions also played a major role in feeding the population. Monasteries and churches distributed food to the poor, especially during difficult seasons or shortages. Long lines formed outside charitable kitchens, where monks handed out bread, soup, and watered wine to widows, travelers, and the desperate. Even in one of the richest cities on earth, poverty remained impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the wealthy citizens of Constantinople passed through these same streets, surrounded by servants and guards, carefully avoiding mud, crowds, and eye contact whenever possible. Expensive perfumes drifted behind noble women, while nearby laborers carried fish baskets, grain sacks, or construction stones heavy enough to permanently rearrange the spine. And somehow, despite the noise, poverty, overcrowding, and endless demand for food, the markets continued functioning day after day, feeding one of the largest cities the medieval world had ever seen, with bread, soup, olives, fish, wine, and remarkable levels of organized chaos. As evening approached and the market crowds thickened once again, another group began moving quietly through the streets of Constantinople. The imperial officials responsible for keeping the city fed, taxed, and only moderately chaotic. This was not an easy assignment. Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the world, and its population consumed astonishing amounts of food every single day. Grain, fish, olives, wine, meat, oil, fruit, and spices flowed constantly through the markets, like rivers feeding a restless beast. If that flow slowed even briefly, panic spread quickly through the streets. So the empire watched the markets carefully. Officials moved between the stalls, inspecting scales, checking grain quality, monitoring bread prices, and making sure merchants were not cheating customers too aggressively. Minor cheating was practically expected. This was still a Mediterranean marketplace. But if sellers pushed prices too high during shortages, or sold rotten food openly, the authorities stepped in before angry citizens decided to solve the issue themselves using bricks. Bread inspectors were especially important. Since bread formed the foundation of the city's diet, the imperial government monitored bakers closely. Bakers caught reducing loaf sizes unfairly or mixing poor ingredients into flour could face fines, public punishment, or temporary closure of their ovens. Nothing attracts public anger faster than bad bread in a crowded capital city already filled with exhausted people. Near the harbor markets, customs officials tracked incoming cargo arriving from across the empire. Grain ships from Egypt and the Black Sea were particularly valuable because Constantinople depended heavily on imported food. Dock clerks recorded shipments while tax collectors calculated duties on wine, spices, oils, and luxury goods. Merchants naturally complained about taxes constantly. This tradition appears to have survived every civilization in recorded history. Meanwhile, soldiers patrolled the busiest market streets to discourage theft and fights. This worked moderately well. Pickpockets still moved through the crowds with remarkable confidence, especially near busy food stalls, where distracted customers focused more on roasted lamb than personal security. One thief reportedly stole an entire loaf of bread from a distracted laborer and vanished into the crowd before the man finished arguing over olive prices. At the same time, imperial officials had to balance control with practicality. Too many restrictions angered merchants. Too little oversight angered the population. Governing Constantinople often resembled carrying a burning candle through a storm, while thousands of hungry people shouted contradictory advice from every direction. And yet somehow, despite corruption, shortages, crowded streets, and endless political tension, the markets continued operating. Because beneath the golden domes, marble palaces, and imperial ceremonies, Constantinople depended on something far simpler than glory. It depended on tomorrow's food arrangement. Living on time. As darkness settled over Constantinople, the markets did not disappear. They simply changed character. Torchlight replaced sunlight along the crowded streets, while oil lamps flickered beneath wooden awnings and hanging fabrics. The daytime heat faded into cooler evening air, but the noise remained almost unchanged. Merchants still shouted prices. Tavern crowds still argued loudly about politics and religion. Somewhere near the harbor, a sailor was almost certainly losing money gambling against a man named something like One-Eyed Nikos, which should have been an obvious warning to everyone involved. The night markets attracted a different rhythm of people. Laborers finishing long days of work wandered through the streets, searching for cheap meals and wine before returning to cramped apartments. Sailors freshly arrived from distant ports explored the markets, carrying foreign coins and questionable confidence. Wealthier citizens emerged in fine clothing, surrounded by servants. Aunts, enjoying the cooler temperatures while pretending the city smelled significantly better after sunset. It did not. Street cooks remained busy late into the night. Roasted lamb still turned slowly above glowing coals, while fish vendors fried the final catches of the day in large pans of oil. Sweet sellers displayed honey pastries, sesame cakes, nuts, and dried fruits beneath lantern light that made everything appear slightly more luxurious than it probably was. Hungry customers crowded around the stalls, carrying clay cups of wine and fresh bread, still warm from evening ovens. The sounds of Constantinople echoed endlessly through the narrow streets. Church bells rang from distant districts. Horn players performed outside taverns overflowing with smoke and laughter. Donkeys clattered across stone roads carrying late cargo deliveries. Nearby, priests moved through the crowds beside merchants, beggars, scholars, and travelers from every corner of the empire. Few cities on earth mixed. So many languages, religions, classes, and cultures into one giant, restless machine powered mostly by trade and exhaustion. Near the harbor, night workers unloaded ships arriving after sunset. Grain sacks, olive jars, wine barrels, and spices continued flowing into the city even in darkness. Feeding Constantinople never stopped. The city consumed food with the relentless appetite of an empire-sized furnace. Meanwhile, crime became slightly more common after dark. Pickpockets moved carefully through crowded alleys, while local gangs watched busy intersections near taverns and markets. Imperial patrols carrying lanterns walked the streets, attempting to maintain order, although many soldiers appeared more interested in finding wine than preventing theft. And above all of it rose the skyline of Constantinople itself. Church domes glowing beneath moonlight, palace walls towering above the harbor, fires flickering across endless streets crowded with humanity. The city still awake long after. Sunset. Still eating, still bargaining, still feeding one of the greatest capitals the medieval world had ever seen. By the final hours of the night, Constantinople should have been quiet, in theory at least. Most cities eventually surrendered to darkness and exhaustion. Constantinople treated both as minor inconveniences. Even past midnight, parts of the markets remained active beneath torchlight and smoky lanterns. Bakers prepared the next morning's bread before the current day had properly ended. Harbor workers unloaded late cargo ships arriving through the Bosphorus, while taverns still overflowed with sailors, merchants, gamblers, and citizens loudly discussing matters they had absolutely no power to influence politically. The city never truly stopped consuming food. Fishmongers cleaned their stalls beside the docks, while stray cats prowled between baskets searching for scraps. Wine sellers counted coins beneath dim oil lamps. Street sweepers pushed piles of spoiled vegetables before. Oaken pottery, ash, and animal waste toured drainage channels that only occasionally functioned as intended. Constantinople was magnificent, wealthy, cultured, and deeply committed to producing smells capable of challenging human optimism. Near the poorer districts, families gathered inside cramped apartments, sharing simple late meals of bread, olives, onions, and watered wine. Workers rested aching legs after entire days spent carrying cargo, building walls, rowing ships, or standing inside overheated bakeries. Through open windows drifted the distant sounds of tavern music, barking dogs, church bells, and arguments continuing somewhere in the darkness over money, politics, or whose cousin had cheated during dice games 3 weeks earlier. Meanwhile, inside wealthy homes, lit by hanging lamps and decorated mosaics, nobles finished elaborate dinners served by household staff. Silver dishes carried roasted meats, imported spices, sweet pastries, and expensive wines into private dining room. Arms far removed from the crowded market streets below. Yet even the rich depended completely on the same chaotic system of merchants, bakers, sailors, fishermen, farmers, and laborers feeding the city every single day. Because, without the markets, Constantinople collapsed. The empire's armies marched on food. Its palaces survived on food. Its churches, taverns, ports, monasteries, and crowded neighborhoods all depended on an endless stream of bread, grain, oil, wine, fish, spices, and livestock arriving constantly from across the Byzantine world. And somehow, despite storms, corruption, fires, riots, invasions, shortages, overcrowding, and politics complicated enough to give philosophers permanent headaches, the system continued functioning day after day, year after year, feeding hundreds of thousands of people inside one of the largest and richest cities on Earth. And as the final lanterns flickered beside the harbor and the first bakers prepared tomorrow's bread beneath glowing oven, Constantinople continued doing what it had always done best, surviving through trade, noise, ambition, and extraordinary amounts of food. The harvest festival did not begin with music or dancing. It began with exhaustion. From sunrise until the final light of evening, the villagers worked through the last day of harvest beneath cold autumn skies. Men cut wheat with aching backs, while women gathered vegetables into baskets already stained with dirt and crushed leaves. Children carried bundles smaller than the adults, but complained twice as loudly about it. Oxen dragged overloaded carts through muddy paths, while crows circled the emptying fields, as if personally offended somebody had stolen their free food. But despite the exhaustion, something in the air felt lighter. The grain had survived the season. That alone deserved celebration. In medieval villages, a failed harvest meant genuine disaster. Hunger was never far away. One summer of heavy rain, drought, disease, or insects could ruin entire communities before winter even arrived. So when the final wagons rolled back toward the village, loaded with wheat, barley, onions, and turnips, people smiled with the kind of relief modern humans usually reserve for surviving tax season or finding out the internet outage was temporary. The villagers gathered near the center square as the last carts arrived. Farmers covered in mud climbed down slowly from the wagons, while neighbors inspected the harvest piles with open satisfaction. Some women crossed themselves in gratitude. Others immediately started calculating how much food might still remain by February. Medieval optimism was always cautious. These were people who understood that happiness could be interrupted at any moment by plague, war, taxes, or one extremely determined goat. Near the edge of the square, servants and laborers began preparing the festival fires. Smoke drifted upward into the evening air, while large iron pots were suspended above wooden flames. The smell of roasting onions and fresh bread slowly spread through the village, replacing the usual scent of wet straw, livestock, and human fatigue. Meanwhile, the ale barrels arrived. Several men rolled them into the square carefully, treating them with more respect than some local nobles received. Harvest ale was cheap, weak, and often tasted slightly suspicious. But after months of brutal labor in cold fields, nobody intended to complain. Medieval peasants were not searching for fine luxury. They were searching for something alcoholic enough to temporarily erase back pain and poor decision-making. Children ran between the wagons, while musicians unpacked fiddles and drums near the bonfires. Young villagers quietly glanced at one another across the square, already aware the festival would bring dancing, flirting, and opportunities for embarrassing social interactions, remembered for years afterward. And as the sun disappeared behind the distant fields, the village slowly transformed. One night, the harvest was finished. Winter had not arrived yet, and ordinary people could finally breathe. As the final harvest wagons settled into the village square and the first bonfires crackled against the cold evening air, attention slowly shifted toward the true centerpiece of the festival. The ale. Not good ale, of course. Nobody in an ordinary medieval village expected sophisticated brewing techniques or delicate flavors with notes of oak and berry. Harvest ale was cheap, cloudy, weak enough to confuse modern drinkers, and occasionally contained mysterious floating particles best ignored for emotional stability. But, after months of hard labor in muddy fields, it was magnificent. The brewers had been working for days preparing enough ale to survive the festival. Large wooden barrels stood beside the square, leaking slightly onto the dirt, while men carrying ladles sampled the contents repeatedly under the noble excuse of checking quality. By sunset, several of these quality specters had already become suspiciously cheerful. The brewing itself had happened in smoky sheds behind the village homes. Women and brewers boiled grain in giant iron pots, while steam filled the air thick enough to make breathing feel optional. Barley, oats, and leftover wheat from the harvest were mixed into hot water before herbs were added for flavor. Medieval ale usually spoiled quickly, which suited villagers perfectly because patience was not traditionally associated with alcohol consumption. Children watched the brewing process carefully from a distance, mostly because adults kept yelling at them to stay away from the boiling pots. One boy ignored these warnings entirely and nearly fell into a barrel before being rescued by an aunt, with reflexes sharpened through years of surviving medieval childcare. As darkness settled over the village, the ale finally began flowing into wooden cups. Farmers gathered near the barrels first, drinking deeply while sitting on overturned crates and wagon wheels. Conversation grew louder almost immediately. Men who had barely spoken during the exhausting harvest suddenly developed passionate opinions about weather patterns, local politics, and wrestling ability from 20 years earlier. One elderly farmer insisted he could still defeat any man in the village despite struggling visibly to sit down without assistance. Nearby, musicians tuned fiddles and pipes beside the fires while villagers passed cups from hand to hand. The ale loosened nerves quickly, especially among younger villagers hoping to impress someone during the evening dances later on. Nothing encourages terrible flirting quite like weak alcohol consumed rapidly in cold weather. Meanwhile, the village priest attempted to maintain dignity while quietly accepting a second cup himself. Medieval festivals often balanced religion and chaos together in deeply uncomfortable harmony. And as laughter spread through the square beneath drifting smoke and torchlight, the festival finally began feeling alive. The fields were empty. The grain was stored. The ale was flowing, which meant medieval peasants could finally dedicate themselves to their second greatest skill after farming, making questionable decisions during community celebrations. As the ale barrels grew lighter and the villagers louder, the smell of food slowly took control of the entire festival square. Smoke rolled upward from the bonfires while hungry crowds gathered around the cooking fires with a desperate concentration of people who had spent the last 3 months surviving mostly on bread, onions, and stubbornness. Tonight was different. Tonight there was meat. Large pigs turned slowly on wooden spits above glowing coals, while fat dripped into the flames with loud hissing sounds that made nearby villagers visibly emotional. Chickens roasted beside them, while iron pots filled with stew bubbled over the fires. The smell spread through the village streets so powerfully that even the dogs stopped fighting for a moment just to stare respectfully at the food. Women moved constantly between the fires, carrying trays of fresh bread, oatcakes, roasted roots, and meat pies. Some balanced entire baskets on their hips while simultaneously shouting instructions at children, arguing with drunk husbands, and preventing cats from stealing dinner. Medieval village women possessed organizational abilities modern military commanders would have admired deeply. Fresh bread arrived from the ovens, still warm enough to burn careless fingers. Thick brown loaves covered the tables beside wheels of cheese, apples, turnips, onions, and bowls of butter. Villagers tore bread apart with rough hands blackened from harvest labor while steam drifted upward into the cold autumn night. Near one of the largest fires, the village butcher carved roasted pork into uneven portions while pretending not to notice several children circling nearby like tiny starving wolves. One boy successfully stole a piece of crackling before immediately tripping into mud 2 steps later. Medieval festivals remained committed to realism. The feast tables filled quickly. Farmers sat beside blacksmiths, laborers beside millers, old women beside loud young men already halfway into disastrous flirting attempts fueled by cheap ale and excessive confidence. Wooden cups slammed against tables, while laughter echoed across the square. For one evening, nobody cared much about debts, taxes, aching backs, or the possibility of winter disease waiting patiently a few months away. Even the local Lord Steward joined the celebration from a safe distance, near the edge of the square, carefully pretending to enjoy peasant food, while clearly terrified by how close everyone stood to him. Medieval class systems became slightly blurrier during festivals, although not blurry enough for anyone to forget who collected taxes later. And as more meat disappeared from the spits and fresh bread continued arriving from the ovens, festival settled fully into celebration. The harvest was done, the food was plentiful, the ale was working, and somewhere in the darkness behind the tables, one pig was quietly beginning to reconsider its current level of supervision. As the feast tables emptied and the ale barrels continued their slow, heroic sacrifice for village morale, the musicians finally took their places near the largest bonfire in the square. This marked the official beginning of the dancing portion of the harvest festival, a medieval tradition proving confidently that rhythm was entirely optional. The fiddlers started first. Sharp strings cut through the cold night air, while drummers pounded heavy rhythms beside the fires. Wooden flutes joined in soon afterward, slightly out of tune but energetic enough that nobody cared. The music echoed across the fields surrounding the village, while sparks drifted upward into the darkness like glowing insects escaping the celebration. Villagers gathered around the fire's almost immediately. The younger men stepped forward first with exaggerated confidence, smoothing hair, adjusting belts, and pretending they had not spent the previous hour nervously rehearsing conversation in their heads beside ale barrels. Young women stood nearby, laughing together while carefully pretending not to notice any of it. Medieval flirting depended heavily on pretending complete emotional indifference while staring constantly at the same person for 6 straight hours. Then, the dancing began. Some couples moved surprisingly well, spinning carefully through the mud while musicians increased the tempo. Others danced with the coordination of collapsing farm equipment. Boots slammed into puddles. Elbows collided with faces. One man accidentally stepped directly into the bonfire circle before being pulled backward by 2 horrified relatives and one very amused blacksmith. Nobody stopped dancing. That was the important part. Harvest festivals were not elegant, noble celebrations held in polished halls beneath chandeliers. These were village gatherings filled with exhausted farmers celebrating temporary survival before winter arrived to ruin everyone's emotional stability again. Precision mattered less than enthusiasm. Meanwhile, older villagers sat near the tables, watching the younger generation embarrass themselves publicly. Elderly women whispered commentary about potential marriages, while old farmers shouted advice nobody asked for. One grandfather claimed he had once been the finest dancer in 3 villages, despite moving now with the structural flexibility of damp firewood. The ale continued flowing heavily. Young men grew braver. Conversations became louder. Compliments became less intelligent. Somewhere near the edge of the square, 2 laborers attempted to dance on top of a wagon and immediately fell off together into a pile of straw. The crowd applauded politely out of respect for commitment, and through all the smoke, laughter, music, and terrible rhythm, the festival square felt alive in a way medieval villages rarely did. For one night, the fields were silent, the harvest was safe, and ordinary people could forget hardship long enough to dance badly beside a fire under the autumn stars. As the dancing grew louder and the musicians drifted deeper into songs, held together mostly by optimism and ale, the harvest festival entered its most dangerous stage of the evening. Young people started talking to each other. For much of the year, medieval village life offered surprisingly few opportunities for romance. Most days involved exhausting labor, crowded homes, suspicious parents, church supervision, livestock emergencies, and neighbors capable of noticing emotional tension from distances normally associated with military scouting. But harvest festivals were different. Tonight, the entire village gathered beneath firelight. Music filled the square, and cheap ale lowered social fear just enough to create confidence far beyond its natu. RAL limits near the bonfires. Groups of young women stood together laughing while pretending not to notice nearby men staring at them with the subtlety of hunting dogs spotting rabbits. Young men approached cautiously, adjusting belts, smoothing hair, and rehearsing opening lines that usually sounded much smarter inside their heads. One farmer's son attempted to impress a girl by describing how quickly he could stack grain sacks during harvest season. Another tried discussing his family's pig ownership with the intensity of a royal diplomat negotiating peace treaties. The girl nodded politely while clearly reconsidering every life decision leading to this conversation. Meanwhile, the village girls were hardly passive observers. Many wore their best wool dresses and braided ribbons into their hair for the festival. They danced together near the fires, exchanged whispered gossip, and quietly judged the young men attempting to impress them through feats of strength, drinking, or deeply necessary shouting. Medieval romance often resembled livestock auctions performed emotionally. The ale made everything worse or better, depending on perspective. Young men became dramatically more confident after several cups, which usually resulted in louder jokes, reckless dancing, and increasingly ambitious flirting attempts. One laborer tried singing to a girl beside the bonfire before forgetting half the words midway through and accidentally insulting her uncle instead. The musicians continued playing anyway. Medieval villages survived through resilience. Parents watched carefully from nearby tables. Older women especially monitored the festival with terrifying awareness. A mother could identify romantic interest from across a crowded square while simultaneously serving bread and criticizing the village baker. Several fathers sat with arms crossed beside the fires, pretending calm while mentally preparing to murder whichever idiot spoke to their daughters incorrectly. Still, Benny. At the awkward conversations and second-hand embarrassment, something genuine existed inside these festivals. Courtships began here. Future marriages formed beside the music and bonfires. Entire families sometimes started because two exhausted peasants danced badly together after harvest season while sharing weak ale beneath the autumn sky. And somewhere nearby, hidden behind a wagon and several barrels, one couple had already discovered that harvest festivals also offered excellent opportunities to disappear briefly from parental supervision. Medieval villages noticed this immediately, of course. They just pretended not to. As the night deepened and the ale reached the point where everyone suddenly believed themselves unusually talented, the harvest festival shifted toward competitive games. This was an important medieval tradition, allowing villagers to strengthen community bonds through organized humiliation. The wrestling matches began first. A rough circle formed near the bonfire, while villagers crowded around, cheering loudly for friends, relatives, and occasionally complete strangers they had chosen to support based entirely on beard quality. The rules were simple. Throw your opponent into the mud before he did the same to you, which happened immediately. The village blacksmith entered first, built like a castle wall with arms thick enough to bend horseshoes without apparent effort. He defeated two farmers in rapid succession before lifting a miller completely off the ground and accidentally throwing him into a basket of onions. The crowd exploded with laughter while the miller emerged smelling aggressively seasoned. Nearby, children played simpler festival games involving apples, sticks, and reckless disregard for personal safety. Boys climbed wagon wheels while girls chased one another between the tables carrying stolen pastries. One child somehow acquired an entire roasted chicken leg and vanished into the darkness before any adult could identify the theft. Medieval survival instincts developed early. The drinking contests followed shortly afterward. Several young men gathered near the ale barrels determined to prove their masculinity through rapid consumption of weak medieval alcohol. This challenge always ended predictably. One participant began loudly singing after his third cup. Another declared eternal loyalty to everyone present. A third attempted to arm wrestle the blacksmith and lost so quickly the crowd barely had time to react before he was already flat on the table, questioning his choices. Meanwhile, tug-of-war contests stretched across the muddy square as entire groups pulled against one another beside cheering spectators. Boots slipped constantly. People fell backward into puddles. At one point, the rope snapped entirely, sending 6 villagers crashing into a cabbage cart with enough force to create what historians would technically classify as an agricultural incident. The musicians continued playing through all of it. Fid. Deals echoed beside roaring fires while dancers stumbled around, exhausted from hours of movement and ale. Older villagers watched the chaos from the tables, shaking their heads despite having behaved exactly the same way 30 years earlier. And then, naturally, disaster arrived. One of the festival pigs escaped. Nobody knew exactly how it happened. One moment, the animal was tied safely beside the roasting area. The next moment, it burst through the crowd, squealing wildly, while villagers leapt aside, spilling ale, bread, and dignity in every direction. Children screamed with excitement. Dogs immediately joined the chase. One drunk farmer attempted to tackle the pig heroically, and instead collided with a barrel hard enough to concern nearby furniture. The crowd roared with laughter because no medieval harvest festival was truly complete until at least one animal escaped into public chaos. Tradition demanded it. The escaped pig charged through the harvest festival like a small, angry bar, teetering ram powered entirely by panic and terrible timing. One moment, villagers were laughing beside the bonfires. The next moment, wooden cups flew into the air as the pig burst between the tables, squealing loudly enough to silence even the drunkest conversations. A tray of fresh bread flipped sideways. Someone dropped an entire bowl of stew directly onto their own boots. One elderly woman shouted curses at the animal with enough precision to make nearby soldiers quietly respectful. Children immediately treated the situation as the greatest event of their lives. They sprinted after the pig through the muddy square, screaming with joy, while dogs joined the chase in complete emotional agreement. The pig zigzagged between villages with astonishing speed, knocking into benches and scattering festival guests like bowling pins. A musician tried lifting his fiddle out of the way and instead fell backward into a puddle while still somehow continuing to play. Near the ale barrels, one farm, R attempted a heroic interception. Unfortunately, he had consumed enough harvest ale to mistake confidence for coordination. He lunged toward the pig dramatically, missed entirely, and crashed headfirst into a wooden cart filled with onions. The crowd exploded with laughter, while the pig escaped beneath another table carrying half a sausage in its mouth, like a criminal fleeing the scene of an extremely personal crime. The local dogs became increasingly invested in the chase. 3 mutts tore across the square, barking wildly, while villagers leaped aside to avoid being trampled. One small boy climbed onto a barrel for safety and immediately began shouting tactical advice, despite clearly understanding nothing about pig capture strategy. Medieval communities valued enthusiasm over expertise in most emergencies. Meanwhile, the pig continued causing destruction with remarkable efficiency. It knocked over cups, slid through spilled ale, and somehow burst directly through the middle of a dan. C-circle without slowing down. Young couples stumbled apart while one elderly man calmly lifted his chair out of the way without interrupting his meal. Experience had taught him this probably would not be the evening's final disaster. Finally, near the edge of the village square, the blacksmith managed to grab the pig around its middle after a struggle involving mud, shouting, and what appeared briefly to be accidental wrestling with another villager entirely. The crowd cheered loudly as the animal squealed in furious protest while being carried back toward the roasting area. The festival slowly settled again afterward. Musicians resumed playing. Ale cups were refilled. Bread was gathered from the ground, with optimism exceeding hygiene standards. Villagers laughed about the chaos, while retelling the story immediately, with increasingly exaggerated details. And honestly, the pig escaping improved the festival considerably, because medieval people understood something modern society occasion. Ionelli forgets. No great celebration becomes memorable until something goes completely wrong. After the pig was finally captured and village dignity partially restored, the harvest festival settled into a slower rhythm. The wild running, wrestling, and public embarrassment gradually faded into something warmer and calmer beneath the autumn night sky. The bonfires became the center of everything. Large flames crackled in the middle of the square, while villagers gathered close against the growing cold. Sparks drifted upward into the darkness as people wrapped themselves in wool cloaks and carried fresh cups of ale back toward the fires. The younger children had finally begun falling asleep against parents or older siblings, exhausted from hours of chasing dogs, stealing food, and surviving medieval childhood with suspicious success rates. The musicians played softer songs now. Fiddles and flutes echoed gently through the square, while villagers sang together beneath the stars. Some song told stories of harvests, old battles, saints, or local legends. Others appeared to exist mainly so drunk farmers could shout the same chorus repeatedly while forgetting half the words. Medieval music valued emotional commitment over technical perfection. Near one fire, elderly villagers began telling stories to the younger generation. Old farmers described terrible winters from decades earlier, when snow buried the roads and grain nearly ran out before spring. Veterans spoke about battles fought under distant lords, while children listened wide-eyed beside the flames. According to one grey-haired man, he had once fought off 3 bandits armed, only with a shovel and good Christian anger. Nobody fully believed him, but the story improved dramatically every year. And honestly, that was what mattered. Meanwhile, young couples drifted quietly away from the loudest parts of the festival. Some walked along the edges of the dark fields beneath moonlight, while others sat together, near small fires, speaking softly enough to avoid public gossip for at least several minutes. Medieval villages lacked privacy almost completely, so harvest festivals offered rare chances for conversation without immediate supervision from relatives, priests, or neighbors professionally dedicated to monitoring romance. The food continued circulating late into the night. Cold bread, leftover pork, roasted apples, nuts, and ale passed from hand to hand while villagers stretched tired legs beside the fires. Smoke clung to clothing and hair while the square glowed warmly against the darkness surrounding the village. And for a little while, life felt unusually peaceful. No harvesting remained. No taxes were due tonight. No lord demanded labor in the fields tomorrow morning. There was only music, firelight, laughter, and the comforting feeling of surviving another growing season together, which in the medieval world counted as genuine happiness. By the final hours of the night, the harvest festival transformed into the slow collapse of an exhausted medieval village, attempting to remain awake through sheer determination and increasingly poor decisions. The bonfires burned lower now, glowing red beneath thick layers of ash, while smoke drifted quietly across the square. Many villagers still sat around the fires, wrapped in wool cloaks, speaking in softer voices after hours of singing, dancing, shouting, and chasing livestock through public spaces. Others had surrendered completely. Several farmers slept directly on benches, while one man somehow managed to fall asleep sitting upright beside an ale barrel, still holding his cup. Nearby, 2 musicians continued arguing about song lyrics neither of them fully remembered anymore. A dog curled beneath the feast table, surrounded by abandoned bones, with the expression of a creature who believed this had been the greatest night in recorded history. The square itself looked devastated. Bread crusts, spilled ale, muddy footprints broke. Cups, ashes, cabbage leaves, and abandoned cloaks covered the ground beneath the torchlight. An overturned wagon still leaned sideways from the pig chase earlier, while several exhausted women stood nearby, already discussing how much cleaning awaited them at sunrise. Medieval festivals created wonderful memories and catastrophic messes in roughly equal proportions. Near the remaining fires, the older villagers continued talking quietly about the harvest ahead. Even during celebration, medieval people never forgot reality for long. Winter was coming. Food would need rationing carefully. Livestock had to survive the cold months. One poor season could still destroy everything. But tonight, at least, the village had enough. Enough grain, enough bread, enough ale.